Hello, all of you beautiful humans. Thais Sky here. Welcome to Reclaim the podcast. I am your host. I am so honored and happy to be here. I took a little social media hiatus last week and I am back feeling super grooved, super excited for this episode. And just reinvigorated. I really needed that social media hiatus. Have you ever taken a social media hiatus? Let me tell you what, it is something else. Particularly if you are like me, where you run a business online. It can get very easily, it's very easy for the nervous system to be set at that level. And it's hard to kind of come down from it. It does really feel like you're coming down from a drug high where you have to like go through a detox and a remembering of who you are. And then once you're back into the sense of, oh, this is who I am without all that noise, it becomes harder to come back, let me tell you. But at the same time, I love the connections I make on social media. And so I am very, very, very honored by all of the people who follow me on Instagram and Facebook. And I love being in community and conversation with all of you. So if you are not a part of my Instagram community, come join me at I am Thais Sky. And if you are better off connecting on Facebook, you can find me there at I am Thais Sky. I believe it's facebook.com/I am Thais Sky. Okay, so in this episode, I am answering one of your questions. If you didn't know, I take your questions and I answer them live. So if you have a question for me on truly anything that you want to ask me, you can email me at info@thaissky.com. And I create a little collection of them, and then I answer them as I can on the podcast. This question is all about developing a different relationship with your parents as an adult, and I'm really excited to get into it. So let's do this. Welcome to Reclaim, a podcast for women, by women, on conversations that matter. I am your host, Thais Sky, international speaker, teacher, and a certified life coach currently working to become a licensed psychotherapist in the state of California. Join me here every week as I offer thoughts and interviews on what it means to reclaim your humanness in this messy world. All right. Here is the question. Hi, Thais. Big fan here. Thanks for taking my question. I know you've written a lot on Instagram about this, but I would love to hear more of your thoughts on navigating not having a close relationship with your parents. As an adult, I have recently decided to cut off my parents, my dad specifically, but also my mom, due to their abusive, hurtful behaviors, but I'm having a hard time feeling okay about it. I feel a lot of pressure to make amends and to play nice. Am I being difficult? Should I just let them in my life? Would love to know would love to know your thoughts. Thanks, Parentless by Choice. Okay, Parentless by Choice. This is a really good topic. This is something I have written extensively on my social media since pretty much since Mother's Day of this past year. I've been writing a lot. In fact, on Mother's Day, this is what I wrote. Okay, I wrote, wanting space from our mothers so that we can heal does not make us bad daughters. And then I write, so many of us feel guilty if we do not have a close relationship with our mothers, particularly if we choose it. Sometimes when deciding between the relationship and our mental health, we have to choose our well-being because sometimes in order to break the transgenerational trauma from our motherline, separation is the only way. Unfortunately, that knowing doesn't necessarily make the decision and the consequent million small decisions to keep your distance any easier. If you have pulled away from your relationship with your mother so that you can tend to the wounds from your childhood, I see you. If you have pulled away from your relationship with your mother so that you can learn who you are, I see you. If you have pulled away from your relationship with your mother so that you can live without constant pain that comes with a relationship, I see you. And hey, maybe it's not forever. Maybe a new relationship can be born when we can stand more tall in who we are. Maybe by tending to our wounds, we can let go of the need to be, for our imperfect mother to love us the way we want it and find a way to relate to her that feels good to us. And maybe it is forever, and that's okay too. Whatever you have decided, prioritizing your mental health doesn't make you a bad daughter. So this really resonated with all of you, and I get it. I think we live in a culture, like you said, parentless by choice, where we feel a lot of pressure from our society to be quote unquote good children as adults. And like, what does it mean to be a good child? It means that we kind of have to internalize this narrative that we are in debt to our parents. So our parents raised us. They did that out of their loving hearts and they gave us food and shelter. And once we become an adult, we are now indebted to our parents. Now we owe them. And it is now the way we owe them is by kind of keeping them in our lives at whatever expense. Now, I do want to acknowledge, before I go much further, that I grew up in a very individualistic narrative here in the United States. And while I am from Brazil, I was born in Brazil, and my family are all in Brazil, minus my mom. I don't actually have a lot of collectivistic notions of the world like my family members do. And so I want to name that's the perspective that I'm going to be talking about this from a very much individualistic narrative, where, the individualistic narrative just kind of implies that like you, kind of have your own back, and that family isn't necessarily, has to be your number one priority. You don't owe your family anything. So that's kind of the perspective I come from. I think that that's important to name. I don't know if that's a narrative that I want to carry in the future in as much clearly, like I'm even having a hard time articulating this. Let me hash out what I want to say here. You know, as we're witnessing the burning of the world, and we're kind of contemplating what a different society can look like, where we are much more in community and much more in a togetherness. I see a need for us to kind of manage our relationships in a different way than I think many individualistic cultures kind of promote, which I think in our culture, we kind of do this thing where it's like, if people aren't exactly the way we want them to be, then we should kind of ditch them. We do this particularly with friendships. We want lifelong friendships, but we're not really taught what that looks like and how to actually cultivate that. And so we kind of use relationships as discardable. It's very transactional. And so I don't know, like moving forward, like I see that we need to be more community leaning. We need to be tending to one another and our needs. We need to move forward in a way that embodies our sovereignty and our autonomy, and our needs to be different, as well as kind of leaning on each other and being in a togetherness that I don't think we really have in our individualistic culture. However, having said that, I am not sure the answer is then a collectivistic culture. You know what I'm saying? Just because I don't necessarily really promote individualism doesn't mean that then what I do promote is collectivism, because I see some issues in that type of mentality as well, just seeing it playing out in my own family dynamics. And so I'm going to be talking about what I'm talking about from the lens of an individualistic person who grew up in a collectivist culture, but lives here and been indoctrinated in this, and so deeply recognizes that we need each other, and a relationship with parents is a very unique, special relationship. If we can have it. But what we don't often talk about is the fact that many of us can't seem to have it. And I think that the reason why we don't talk about it is because there's a lot of shame there, because there is an expectation that we can get along with our families, that we can get along with our parents, and that we should do whatever, we should contort ourselves and bend over backwards and do whatever possible in order to make nice with our families. And I'm not sold on that idea. I think that as grown-ups, we get to decide what our relationships are, and if they are continually unsustainable, like if they are dehumanizing and jeopardize our mental health, I think it's very valuable for us to question that. I don't think the answer necessarily is to cut our parents off. I think that's one option. And I think for many of us, we're terrified of that option because we live in a culture that tells us that that's selfish, that's bad, and that we should never choose ourselves. Again, because we're somehow indebted to our families. I think that that's a very selfish narrative, this idea that we're indebted to our families, because it's not like we asked to be born and we asked them to do all that, right? Many of us actually having children is a very selfish desire. We're desiring to bring a human onto this planet because we want to put all of our unmet needs and all of our projections onto this child and really raise like a mini us. I mean, I'm not saying that that's the perspective of many people. I'm just saying that that is a perspective that I have seen an unconsciously play out in a lot of parent-child relationship. And so in some ways, like having kids is a very selfish thing, and we're doing it because we hope we will get something out of it. And so then to have the child didn't necessarily ask to be born, I guess maybe on a spiritual level, but certainly the child did not give consent to be born and then didn't really choose us. Again, we're not talking on a spiritual level. Let's say we're talking a very human level. It's not like the child chose to have us as parents. And so we kind of do the best that we can and we fuck up and whatever. And then once they turn into adults, they owe us that. I mean, being a parent is not like, something that we do to get something back from the child once the child is an adult. That's not why we should be parents. And so I'm not convinced that we owe our parents anything. I think if we can have a relationship with them and if we have the desire to support them financially, if that feels right for us, if that feels right for the relationship, if that feels right according to your life, I think that that's great. But again, there's a difference between like wanting the well-being of our parents and supporting them financially and then feeling like that we owe them that. I just don't like that idea of owing. I don't know if any of this is making sense, but we're just going to keep going. So this idea that like we have to be in relationship with our parents no matter the cost, I think is bull. I think we as adults have the choice, and that choice is whether or not we want a relationship or what type of boundaries we want to have in order for the relationship to be sustainable. So here's something else I wrote. I wrote, you can both love your parents and be grateful for everything they did for you and name the ways you have been hurt, wounded, or traumatized by their behavior. And this needs to be said, because I think when we're doing work, when we're in therapy, it can sound an awful lot like we're blaming our parents for everything. And that's not what we're doing. We're putting responsibility where the responsibility is at. Because I think for many of us, we took on what was not ours to take on. So I write, when working with my clients and in Worthy Women Rise, we inevitably traverse the terrain of exploring childhood, and so many women feel the need to preface their pain with a statement of love about their parents, such as, don't get me wrong, I love my mom. It's just that she really hurt my feelings when she blinked. Sometimes we don't even go that far and admit that we were hurt or traumatized by our parents' behavior because we think it's a betrayal to their love. They did so much for us, how can we possibly complain? This belief can be unconscious or sometimes can be conscious or sometimes it's unconscious, and it manifests in having no bad memories from childhood, but a deep sense that there's obviously something there. But I think if we go underneath the surface, the real resistance to naming the pain is a fear that we will risk the attachment if we are to confront the ways they did not attune to us. This was a necessary strategy when we were little, to only remember the good stuff and to paint our parents in a perfect light so we can stay attached to them and get our needs met. As adults, though, the strategy is now preventing us from tending to the wounds that are screaming for our attention. It may be helpful to remember that both can be true. You can both name your pain and the ways your parents did not attune to you and be grateful for what they were able to offer. You can hold on to the good memories because they are valid and real, and also tend to the spaces within you that felt neglected or abandoned because that is valid and real too. So it's very easy for us to dismiss our needs in the name of staying attached to our parents by kind of pretending that nothing bad ever happened. And this is how we gaslight ourselves, essentially, right? We essentially say to ourselves, it's fine. They did the best they could. It's okay. But everything else about my childhood was great. And we try to write off the pain. And so because there is pain and because we're not attended to the pain, sometimes the easiest thing we can do is to cut them off completely. Cutting them off completely is a very big act, and it's not always necessary. Sometimes it is. And sometimes what we can offer before we take on that step is to do some of our own healing work of really sitting with the pain that came from childhood and then came from our parents' neglect, hurt, misattunement, etc. Like I've mentioned before in this podcast, it doesn't have to be a capital T trauma for it to have really affected you. So by capital T trauma, I mean, it doesn't have to be something like physical abuse, sexual abuse. It doesn't have to be that loud, that overt, that intense for it to have been a real significant misattunement for you. And it's important to say that because oftentimes we think, oh, well, I was never abused, and so my childhood was fine. But there's a lot between being abused and having a fine childhood, and a lot of gray. And doing the work of developing a different relationship with our parents first really requires us to have a different relationship with ourselves. And that's what I think is really, really important to take away from my thoughts around this, is that if we want our relationship to our parents to include us, we have to advocate for ourselves. But I think most of us enter a relationship with our parents as adults with the same dynamics that happened as a child, where we kind of maybe unconsciously hope that they will save us, that they will protect us, that they have our best interest in mind. But now as an adult, it's your responsibility to have your best interest in mind, not your parents. And it's not their responsibility now to have your best interest in mind. And that's hard to face as well. It's not up to them anymore, whether you're safe and happy. That's now up to you. And that's a huge responsibility. But we have to stop putting that responsibility on them. Yes, they had that responsibility, but now that's on you. By the way, I had this conversation with Jay Chavez on this podcast, and it was so beautiful. And it was specifically around mother and mothering. I highly recommend that episode. And also, if you want to dig into the archives, there's a beautiful episode with Bethany Webster on the mother wound. I really respect Bethany and all the work that she does on addressing the mother wound. And so I highly recommend that interview as well. It was so potent, so good. But just know that this conversation about parenting is not new to this podcast. Okay, here's one more Instagram post for you that I wrote. You do not have to carry the guilt your parents try to place on you for needing space to heal, and that doesn't make you a bad person. So I write, as we attempt to cultivate boundaries with our parents and find the distance we need to heal, we often experience a lot of feelings of guilt. This is particularly true when our parents try to place guilt onto us for not being who they think we should be. Often this guilt makes us feel like we are a bad person. Just because your parents are trying to make you feel guilty, however, doesn't mean you have to take that on as true. You know what is true for you. You're allowed to want to find a way to relate to your parents that work for you and your well-being. The best thing you can do to honor and respect and love our families is to find a way to be in relationships that feel most in integrity with our needs. Honoring all you have had to make the most difficult, honoring all of you have had to make the most difficult decision of choosing space right now. So, you are allowed to want space. And I think so many of us feel so guilty for that. And our parents then, they feel disconnected. And so they will most likely say something. And then you get to decide if you want to carry the guilt or not. But again, space is necessary for all healthy relationships. We don't have to be on top of each other all the time to have a healthy relationship. And so you get to decide what that space looks like. You get to decide what that boundary looks like. Okay. So I will say though that most relationships, in order for it to be healthy and vital and happy, both parties must, be contributing to the work. Both parties have to be an active participant in growing. Unfortunately, for many of us, our parents are not on that journey. And so part of then the invitation is learning to accept them for who they are and learning to accept that they're never going to be able to meet the needs that you still have and still wish that they would meet. Because that's a really important component of having a relationship with them, is unhooking them from who you think that they should be. They are not going to be the people you want them to be. No matter the strongest fantasy you could have about, what type of parent you want, they're not going to be that parent. And that's really hard work of grieving the parents you will never have, and giving yourself permission to be with the little girl, the little child inside of you, who feels neglected and abandoned by them. That needs to be tended to. And I've talked a lot about reparenting on the podcast. I highly recommend you going and checking out previous episodes on reparenting, because the best way that we can unhook our parents from this expectation is by reparenting, by being our own parents now as adults, the way that we wish our parents were to us. The more that we can unhook our parents from the expectation that we have of them, the more we can then hold their limitations and hold who they are and not need them to be anything more for our own happiness, because that is a sign of suffering, right? Of misery. It's really, really, really important to do that unhooking work. As you do that unhooking work, there will be a new relationship that will be cultivated between the two of you because you've changed. However, we have to manage our expectations here. Relationships are two people. And if they're not willing to do their own work of looking at how they can be better for you, as their child, it's going to be really hard to have the type of relationship you want. And that is hard to face, because I think a lot of us really, really, really hope that if we continue to contort ourselves and people please and do whatever, then we'll finally get the love that we never got. But most of the time, our parents are kind of stuck in their ways and they're not willing to do that work. And so then it's up to us to unhook them, to learn to accept them, to tend to our own little girl or inner child. If you're a man listening to this, right? To really be with your own inner kid, reparenting yourself and putting up boundaries. Clear communication and boundaries goes a long way. So, Parentless by Choice, I hope I have given you some things to think about. I have been working with clients who have gone through their own journey of cutting off their parents to different degrees and developing new relationships with them. And one thing that I think is important to sit with is this decision to cut off our parents. So we sometimes do this as a desire to not feel the pain of our childhood or of their abuse. But again, while in many ways, sometimes that's necessary and important and vital, sometimes cutting parents off comes with the fantasy that then the pain will be gone. But there's a whole new slew of pain that typically comes because it's very hard to cut off our parents. There's a lot of emotional connection. And so if you are thinking about cutting your parents off with the hope that the pain will go away, the truth is the pain will just metamorphosis into something different. The pain will be there. So it's not about whether or not to cut them off, but really whether or not you're willing to sit with the pain and be with the pain and honor the pain and process the pain, so that, again, you can unhook them and decide with a little bit more clarity what type of relationship you want to have. Also, the thing about cutting parents off is that sometimes we hope that just by making that decision, like I'm cutting them off, then we kind of don't have to think about it again. But what most people who have cut off their parents, they experience is a continual questioning of whether or not they did the right thing. And so cutting people off, like, it comes with a lot of emotions. It's not the easy choice. And so it's important to give ourselves plenty of space to recognize that cutting people off is sometimes not a one and done decision, but a continual invitation and exploration of whether or not you want to continue to cut them off. And so sometimes it may be helpful to cut them off, make that decision to cut them off, but know that that's a temporary decision and that you have permission to change your mind at any point in the future. You don't have to cut them off forever. You may again want to, and that's okay too. But it may be helpful. I just hit my knee. It may be helpful to think about, cutting them off as like just a temporary reprieve. And then in a year, 6 months, 2 months, you can reevaluate and decide what you want to do then. If you are on the other side of this, where your parents have completely cut you off because they cannot accept who you are, that is one of the most painful experiences a human can have, particularly if they cut you off because, let's say, of your sexuality or because of your identity. It's just the most cruel and hurtful thing that parents can do. And also, it's right there is further proof that parenting or having a child is in many ways a selfish deed. Because if you choose to have a child on this planet and then you can't accept that child for their identities and their evolutions, and them stepping into who they really want to be and who they are, if you can't accept that, then why are you having children to begin with? You're obviously having a child because you want them to conform to who you think they should be, and that's just not fair. And so if you are this recipient of your parents cutting you off, I'm sending you so much love. That pain is it's really intense. And, I think the best thing that we can do in those cases is to really create a community of friends that can be family. Because that is one of the beautiful things about being human, is that in many ways we also get to choose our families. We're not stuck with the families that were given to us by birth. We can choose our families based on our friends and our loved ones, and really create a community that we feel like we are understood in. And that's a real beautiful gift that we get to have. Obviously, it doesn't replace the pain. That's not what I'm trying to say. But it is something that we can also lean into. Okay, I think those are all of my thoughts around this, Parentless by Choice. I hope that this has supported you. One thing to note is that people typically don't change unless they really want to. So if your family is abusive and hurtful, odds are they will continue to be that way. And there's no need for you to put yourself in the crossfire just because you want to, quote unquote, play nice. I don't even know what play nice means. I don't even like the idea of play nice, because it really just means putting other people's feelings above your own. And I don't think that being an asshole is the answer either, obviously, but I think that's often what we think is the opposite of play nice, is being an asshole. And I don't think you choosing your mental health is being an asshole. Whether or not you're being difficult, I think that that's a question that a lot of women ask themselves, because we've been told that our needs are difficult. So I'm honoring that question. And I think being difficult is just like being bossy or being a bitch, just totally fine. I don't see any problems with being difficult. Choosing yourself is one of the most important things that we can do. Okay. So boundaries. That's the answer to everything, is boundaries, and a continual conversation with yourself, continual conversation with them if they're in a place that they can hear it. I definitely think that conversations have a lot of healing, and people are capable of change. People can surprise and delight you if you give them that opportunity, but you're going to have to advocate for your needs. You're going to have to be clear about what you want. Go to therapy, or hire a coach or a healer or a teacher, or be in your own work, because reparenting is the most helpful thing that we can do to unhook our parents. And for all of you who are navigating complex relationships with your parents, just know that you're so not alone. And just because it's not a mainstream conversation doesn't mean it's not happening to households all across the world. And ultimately, the more that we can talk about this with one another, the more we remove the stigma around it, and then we get to have more autonomy of what we want it to look like, instead of being stuck in feeling like we owe somebody something. All right. I am sending you all of my love. I have some really amazing interviews coming up, so stay tuned, and I will talk to you all next week.
Thank you for listening to Reclaim the Podcast. This podcast represents the opinions of Thais Sky and her guests to the show. The content of this podcast are for informational and educational purposes only, and is not intended to be a substitute for professional psychological, psychiatric, or medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified mental health provider with any questions you may have regarding a medical condition or mental disorder.